How far would you go to protect someone you love when your own family starts turning against them? Join finally finds Tieu injured and brings her home. But everything changes when his mother secretly questions her intentions and plants doubt that shatters trust between them. Stay with this story, and don't forget to subscribe for more emotional drama like this. Join had been searching for hours. The small stream was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the world itself had pulled away all sound and left him alone with his thoughts. Water moved gently over smooth stones, slipping between gaps in the earth, reflecting the dim light of a fading afternoon. Trees leaned over the path in uneven shapes, their shadows stretching long across the ground. But Join wasn't paying attention to any of it. He kept calling out her name, Tieu, again and again. His voice echoed faintly, breaking apart in the open air, swallowed quickly by the forest. Every time there was no answer, his chest tightened a little more. His steps became faster, more desperate, as if speed alone could force reality to change. He didn't know how long she had been missing, only that she had left in silence, without explanation, and no one had been able to reach her since. When he heard the news, something inside him snapped into motion. There was no planning, no hesitation. He just ran, because it was Tieu, and because his mother had been worried too. That thought stayed in his mind the entire time. She must be scared. She must be alone. Join pushed through another stretch of rocks near the stream. His shoes slipped slightly on the wet surface, but he didn't slow down. His breathing was heavy now, his throat dry from calling out too much. Then he stopped. For a moment, everything went still. It wasn't a sound he heard clearly. It was more like a feeling, a faint presence, something that didn't belong to the empty landscape. He looked around slowly. Tieu, he called again, softer this time. Silence, but then a faint breath, barely noticeable. Join turned sharply toward the sound. His heart started beating faster, not from fear this time, but from something closer to hope. He moved carefully, stepping over stones, pushing past low branches until he saw a shape near the edge of the stream. And everything inside him froze. There she was. Tieu was sitting on a large rock, half hidden by the uneven terrain. Her posture was weak, unstable. One leg was bent awkwardly, her hand tightly holding her ankle. Even from a distance, it was obvious something was wrong. Her face was pale, too pale. Her hair was messy, strands stuck to her forehead. She looked exhausted, like she had been fighting pain for far too long without rest. For a second, Join couldn't move. Then he ran. Tieu, his voice broke through the silence, louder this time, filled with shock and relief all at once. Her head lifted slowly. When their eyes met, something changed in her expression. Surprise, relief, and something deeper she didn't know how to express. Join, she whispered. Just his name. That was all she could manage. He dropped to his knees beside her immediately, scanning her condition. His hands hovered for a second, unsure where to touch, afraid of hurting her more. What happened? Are you okay? Can you move? He asked quickly, his voice uneven. She tried to shift slightly, but immediately winced. I fell, she said weakly. My foot, I think it twisted. Join exhaled sharply, frustration and worry mixing in his expression. You're injured, and you stayed here alone? Tieu Hoa didn't answer. Her silence said everything. Join looked at her ankle more closely. It was swollen, clearly injured, likely a sprain from slipping on the wet stones. The situation wasn't life-threatening, but it was serious enough that walking would be painful and dangerous. He shook his head slightly. "You really scared everyone," he said quietly. "My mother too. She's been worried about you the whole time." At that moment, something flickered in Tieu Hoa's eyes. A subtle change, like the mention of his mother, touched a place she didn't want to think about. Join noticed it, but didn't push further. Instead, he removed his jacket without hesitation. "Put this on," he said. She hesitated. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," he interrupted gently but firmly. "Just wear it." He placed the jacket over her shoulders. It was warm, carrying his body heat, shielding her from the cold air drifting through the stream valley. For a moment, she just sat there, holding the fabric lightly, as if unsure whether she deserved it. Join then carefully positioned himself closer. "I'm going to carry you," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. "I can walk." "You can't," he cut in, not harshly, but decisively. "Don't argue with me." Before she could respond again, he slipped one arm behind her back and the other under her knees and lifted her. She let out a small breath of surprise, instinctively holding onto his shoulder for balance. The sudden closeness made her tense for a second, but then she slowly relaxed as she realized he was steady, careful, not rushing anything. Join adjusted his grip, making sure she was secure. "Hold on," he said softly. Then he started walking. The path back was uneven. Stones shifted underfoot. The air felt heavier now, like the forest itself had become more aware of their presence. But Join didn't stop. Every step was measured, every movement careful. Tieu Hoa stayed quiet in his arms, her head slightly resting against his shoulder. She didn't speak, but her breathing slowly steadied. For a while, only the sound of footsteps and flowing water filled the space between them. Then Join spoke again. "You shouldn't have come out here alone," he said. His tone wasn't angry, more like worried exhaustion. "I didn't plan it," she replied softly. There was a pause. Then Join asked, "Where were you going?" She hesitated. "I just wanted somewhere quiet." His grip tightened slightly, not in anger, but in concern. "Quiet doesn't mean dangerous places like this." She didn't respond. The silence returned again, but this time it felt heavier. As they moved further away from the stream, the trees became denser. The light dimmed slightly. Join kept his eyes forward, focusing on the path, but his thoughts were elsewhere. After a while, he spoke again. "Actually, my mother was really worried about you." Tieu Hoa's fingers tightened slightly on his sleeve. "She kept asking me if I found you yet." At that moment, her expression shifted slightly again, but she kept it hidden. Join continued, unaware of how deep his words were cutting into her thoughts. She said, "When I find you, I should bring you home first. Then we'll figure everything else out later." Tieu Hoa looked down. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I caused trouble for everyone." Join immediately shook his head. "No, that's not what this is. It's not trouble, it's concern. There's a difference." But she didn't answer. The rest of the walk continued in silence, and as they got closer to home, neither of them noticed how much this moment, this quiet rescue, would soon change everything that came after. The rest of the walk back felt longer than it should have, not because the distance changed, but because the silence between them started to feel heavier with every step Join took. Tieu remained in his arms, quiet and still, but her thoughts were clearly somewhere far away. The village path slowly appeared through the trees. A few rooftops came into view, followed by the faint outline of familiar fences and narrow lanes. It looked normal, peaceful even, but for Tieu nothing felt normal anymore. Join adjusted his grip slightly as they reached flatter ground. "Almost there," he said gently. She gave a small nod, but didn't speak. When they finally arrived at his house, the gate creaked softly as Join pushed it open with his shoulder. The place was modest, simple, but warm in a way that immediately contrasted with the cold, damp forest they had just left. He carried her inside carefully, stepping over the threshold without hesitation. "Sit here," he said, lowering her onto a wooden chair near the entrance. Tieu winced slightly as her foot touched the ground again, but she quickly hid the discomfort. Join immediately noticed. "I'll get some warm water and bandages," he said. "Don't move too much." She nodded again, and then he disappeared into the house. For a moment, Tieu was alone. The silence here was different, not empty, but filled with life. Small sounds from inside the house, the faint smell of wood, and the warmth that slowly reached her skin. She held onto the jacket Join had given her, still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her ankle throbbed, but she barely focused on it, because her mind wasn't on the pain anymore. It was on everything else. The way Join had found her without hesitation. The way he carried her like it was the most natural thing in the world. And most of all, his mother. That word kept echoing in her mind. She lowered her head slightly, staring at her hands. "I'm causing problems again," she whispered to herself. A few minutes later, Join returned with a basin of warm water and a small medical kit. He set everything down carefully beside her. "Let me see your foot," he said. Tieu hesitated for a second, then slowly moved her leg forward. Join knelt down in front of her, completely focused now. His earlier urgency had shifted into calm concentration. He gently examined her ankle, pressing lightly around the swollen area. She flinched slightly. "Sorry," he muttered immediately, softening his touch. "It's okay," she replied. He carefully began cleaning the area, his movements precise and careful. The room stayed quiet, except for the faint sound of water and fabric shifting. After a while, he spoke again. "You need to rest for at least a couple of days," he said. "No walking around, no pushing yourself." Tieu gave a small, almost absent nod. Join looked up briefly. "You're not listening, are you?" That made her pause. "I am," she said softly, but her voice didn't sound convincing. Join sighed lightly, not in frustration, but in concern. "I know you've been going through something," he said more gently, "but disappearing like this, it doesn't solve anything." Tieu looked away. "I didn't mean to make anyone worry." "I know," Join replied, "but it still happened." That sentence lingered in the air for a moment. He finished wrapping her ankle with a clean bandage, then sat back slightly, wiping his hands. "You should stay here until you recover," he added, "at least until you can walk properly again." Tieu looked up immediately. "I can't stay here that long." "Why not?" She hesitated. For a second, it looked like she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come out. Instead, she just shook her head slightly. It wouldn't be right. Join frowned slightly. It's just rest, nothing else. But she didn't respond. The conversation stopped there, but the tension didn't disappear. It stayed, quiet but present, like something unspoken sitting between them. Later that evening, the house became calmer. Join prepared a small meal and insisted she eat something. She didn't eat much, but she tried. Afterwards, she rested on a simple bed in the corner room, while Join stayed nearby, occasionally checking on her. The night passed slowly. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees. Inside, everything was quiet, except for the occasional sound of shifting fabric or soft footsteps. By the second day, Tieu had improved slightly. The swelling had reduced, and she could move a little more without as much pain. Still, she didn't leave the room much. Join, on the other hand, stayed busy but attentive. He checked on her regularly without being intrusive. On the morning of the third day, the atmosphere felt different, warmer, more stable. Tieu finally stood up carefully and tested her foot. It still hurt, but it was manageable. "You're recovering faster than I expected," Join said, watching her from the doorway. She gave a faint nod. "I think I can walk now." "Slowly," he reminded her immediately. That afternoon, Join suggested something different. "You should come with me," he said. Tieu looked at him. "Where?" "To see my mother." That sentence made her pause completely. For a moment, she didn't react at all. Join noticed her expression change. "She really wants to meet you," he added calmly. "She's been asking about you every day." Tieu hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Join interrupted gently. "Just come. She'll be happy to see you." She stayed silent for a long time. Then finally, she nodded. "Okay." And so, later that day, they left the house together. The walk wasn't long, but every step Tieu took felt different this time. Not because of pain, but because of something else she couldn't fully explain. When they reached Join's home, she stopped for a brief second at the gate. Her heart felt heavier. Join noticed. "It's okay," he said softly. "Just follow me." He opened the door and led her inside. His mother was already there, and the moment she saw Tieu her expression immediately softened into a warm, welcoming smile. "Ah, you're finally here," she said kindly. The atmosphere inside the house quickly shifted. Warm tea was prepared. Chairs were pulled closer. Light conversation filled the room. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful, almost comforting. Tieu slowly began to relax. She answered softly when spoken to. She even managed a small smile once or twice. Join sat nearby, occasionally glancing at both of them, relieved that things seemed to be going well. But then, at some point, Join stood up. "My friend is calling me. I need to take this," he said, checking his phone. He gave a small nod to his mother and Tieu before stepping outside. The door closed, and the atmosphere changed instantly. Not loudly, not obviously, but subtly. His mother's smile remained for a few seconds longer, then slowly faded. She looked at Tieu differently now, still polite, but sharper, more direct. A silence stretched between them. Then she finally spoke. "Tell me honestly," she said calmly. Tieu blinked slightly. "Yes?" His mother leaned forward slightly, her voice still soft but firm underneath. "What exactly are your intentions with Join?" Tieu froze. The question wasn't loud, but it hit hard. Before she could respond, the woman continued, "Are you approaching him because of money or something else?" Tieu Hoa's breath caught. Her hands tightened slightly in her lap. His mother watched her carefully, then added, "If it's money you need, just say it. I can give you whatever amount you want." The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier. Tieu Hoa's eyes slowly filled with tears, but she quickly looked down, trying to hide it. She didn't want Join to know. She didn't want him to come back and hear any of this, because she knew if he did, he would be hurt. And that was the last thing she wanted. But even as she stayed silent, trying to hold everything in, the words from his mother kept echoing in her mind. And deep inside, something began to crack, something she could no longer ignore. The silence in the room felt different now. It wasn't the peaceful kind that came from comfort or understanding. It was the kind of silence that pressed down on the chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. Tieu Hoa kept her head lowered. Her hands were tightly clasped together in her lap, fingers pressing into each other as if she was trying to hold herself together physically. She didn't dare look up, not at his mother, not at anything in the room, because if she did, she was afraid she would completely break. His mother watched her quietly for a few seconds, studying her reaction without rushing. The expression on her face remained composed, but there was no warmth left in her eyes now, only a careful, almost analytical calm. "I asked you a question," she said again, this time slower. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm enough to fill every corner of the room. Tieu Hoa swallowed hard. Her throat felt dry. She started, but her voice cracked slightly, forcing her to stop. She took a shaky breath, trying again. "I didn't come here for anything like that." Her words were soft, barely steady, but they were real. His mother didn't respond immediately. Instead, she leaned back slightly in her chair, still observing. Outside, faint footsteps could be heard. Join was still on the phone. His voice was distant, muffled through the walls. That sound alone made Tieu Hoa's heart tighten even more, because she knew he had no idea what was happening inside, and she didn't want him to know. His mother finally spoke again. "You're saying that now," she said calmly, "but I've seen many people like you before." That sentence hit harder than anything else. Tieu Hoa's fingers tightened. "I'm not like that," she said quickly, a little more emotional this time. "I never asked him for anything. I didn't even want to come here." Her voice trembled at the end. She stopped, pressing her lips together tightly to stop herself from breaking down completely. But it was already too late. Her eyes were burning now. His mother's expression didn't soften. Instead, she continued in the same steady tone. "Then why are you with him?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and impossible to escape. Tieu Hoa didn't answer right away, because the truth was, she didn't even know how to answer it properly herself. Her mind flashed back to everything. The moment Join found her at the stream, the way he carried her without hesitation, the warmth of his jacket around her shoulders, the safety she felt when he told her not to worry. All those moments were real, but they also made everything more complicated. "I didn't plan any of this," she whispered finally. "It just happened." His mother narrowed her eyes slightly. "Things don't just happen like that," she said. "People make choices." Tieu Hoa's breathing became uneven. She felt trapped, Not physically, but emotionally. Like every direction she turned led to the same pressure pushing down on her. I know you're worried about him, Tieu said softly, trying to stay respectful, but I would never use him. I promise. There was a pause. Then his mother spoke again, even more directly this time. If that's true, then tell me. What do you want from him? Tieu froze again. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. What did she want? She didn't even know anymore. She wanted peace. She wanted to stop feeling lost. She wanted to stop hurting people around her. But none of those answers felt like something she could say out loud. So she stayed silent, and that silence said too much. His mother exhaled slowly, as if she had already reached her conclusion. If you can't answer that, she said, then maybe you shouldn't be near him. That sentence landed like a heavy stone. Tieu's eyes widened slightly. No, she said immediately, shaking her head. Please don't say that. Her voice cracked completely now. I didn't do anything wrong. I really didn't. But even as she spoke, her voice grew weaker. The tears she had been holding back finally slipped out, rolling down her cheeks before she could stop them. She quickly looked away, trying to wipe them, trying to hide it, because she knew Join was just outside, and if he walked in right now, everything would collapse. At that exact moment, footsteps approached from outside. Her heart stopped for a second. Join's voice got closer. I'm done. Sorry, that took a while. The door handle moved. Tieu panicked internally. His mother reacted instantly. Her expression changed completely. The sharpness disappeared. The calm, warm smile returned as if nothing had happened at all. Just like that. The transformation was almost unsettling. Come in, Join, she said gently. The door opened. Join stepped inside, still holding his phone. His eyes moved between both of them immediately. Something felt off. Not obvious, but subtle. The atmosphere was slightly too quiet. His mother smiled at him. Everything is fine, she said casually. We were just talking. Join nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered on Tieu a little longer than usual. She was looking down. Her face seemed a little too still, too controlled. Are you okay? He asked her gently. Tieu flinched slightly at the question. Then she quickly nodded. Yes, I'm okay. But she didn't look at him. That was what made him pause. Join frowned slightly. Something was wrong. He could feel it, but he didn't know what. His mother stood up smoothly. I'll go prepare some more tea, she said. You two talk. And before either of them could respond, she walked out of the room, just like that, leaving them alone. The door closed softly behind her. Silence returned again, but this time it felt even heavier. Join stepped closer. Did something happen? He asked quietly. Tieu immediately shook her head. No, nothing happened. Her answer came too fast, too forced. Join studied her face carefully now. Her eyes were slightly red. She was trying to hide it, but she wasn't doing a good job. Tieu, he said gently, lowering his voice. Look at me. She hesitated. For a second, she didn't move. Then slowly, she raised her eyes, but only for a moment, because the moment their eyes met, she quickly looked away again. Join's expression grew more serious. You were crying, he said softly. Her shoulders tensed immediately. I'm fine, she repeated quickly, but her voice was shaky, too shaky. Join didn't push further right away. Instead, he sat down beside her, keeping a calm distance so she wouldn't feel pressured. "Did my mother say something to upset you?" he asked carefully. That question made her freeze. Her fingers tightened again. She shook her head immediately. No, she was kind. She was just talking. But her voice betrayed her. It didn't sound convincing at all. Join stayed silent for a moment. He wasn't angry, but he was worried and confused, because nothing made sense right now. His mother was smiling when he came back. Tieu was crying, and neither of them were telling him the truth. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. "I don't like this feeling," he said quietly. Tieu's breath caught slightly, but she still didn't say anything. The silence stretched again, heavy, uncomfortable, and full of things neither of them were ready to say out loud. The room stayed quiet after that. Not peaceful quiet, something sharper, something that made every second feel longer than it should have been. Join remained seated beside Tieu, but he wasn't relaxed anymore. His posture had changed slightly, shoulders a bit more tense, eyes occasionally shifting toward her face, trying to read what she clearly didn't want to show. Tieu kept her gaze lowered. Her hands were still tightly clasped together in her lap, but now they were trembling slightly. She tried to hide it by pressing them harder together, as if pressure could stop emotion. But it didn't. The truth was already sitting between them, even if neither of them said it out loud. Join finally broke the silence again. "Tieu, he said softly. She didn't respond immediately. Her name sounded different when he said it now. Heavier, like it carried more meaning than just a call. After a moment, she answered quietly. "Yes?" Join exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "You don't seem okay." That sentence made her freeze slightly, because it wasn't a question. It was an observation. And worse, he was right. "I am okay," she said quickly again, the same answer she had been repeating. But this time, even she seemed to realize how weak it sounded. Join didn't push her immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the floor for a moment as he thought. Then he spoke again. "I know my mother can be strict," he said. "Sometimes she doesn't express things the right way." Tieu's breath caught slightly at that. Her heart started beating faster again, because even hearing him mention his mother made everything come back in fragments. The questions, the tone, the implication hidden underneath polite words. But she still didn't speak. Join continued, voice softer now. "If she said something that made you uncomfortable, I need you to tell me." That line hit her harder than expected, because it wasn't pressure, it was concern, real concern, and that made it worse for her. Tieu shook her head immediately. "No, she didn't do anything wrong," she said, a little too fast again. "Really, she was just asking normal things." Join looked at her for a long moment. He didn't believe her, not fully, but he also didn't want to force her. So instead, he stayed quiet, and that silence became its own kind of pressure. A few seconds passed, then Tieu suddenly spoke again, almost like she couldn't hold it in anymore. "I think I should go soon," she said quietly. Join turned toward her immediately. "What?" Her fingers tightened again. "I've stayed long enough. My foot is better now. I don't want to disturb your family anymore." Join frowned. "That's not how it works," he said firmly, but still calm. "You're not disturbing anyone." But she shook her head slightly. "I already am," she said. voice low. That sentence made something shift in Join's expression. "Why would you think that?" he asked. Tieu hesitated. Her lips parted slightly, but she stopped herself. Because if she spoke the truth, even partially, everything would become heavier. Instead, she forced a small shake of her head again. "It's just, I feel like I should leave." Join studied her closely now. This wasn't about the injury anymore. It wasn't even about recovery. Something else had happened. Something she wasn't saying. He leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. "Did something change while I was outside?" he asked. Tieu immediately shook her head. "No. Too fast, too automatic." And that was all the confirmation he needed that something was wrong. Join stayed silent for a moment. Not angry, just thinking. Then he spoke again, softer than before. "You can tell me anything." That sentence made her chest tighten, because she believed him. That was the problem. She did believe him, and that made it harder to keep things inside. Her eyes began to sting again, but she quickly blinked a few times, trying to hold it back. "I just don't want to be a burden," she said finally. Join shook his head immediately. "You're not?" "I am," she whispered. The way she said it wasn't an argument. It sounded like something she had already accepted long ago. Join frowned deeper now. "That's not true," he said, "and you shouldn't think like that." But Tieu didn't respond, because no matter what he said, the words from his mother were still echoing in her mind. "Are you here for him or for something else? If it's money, I can give you whatever you want." Even if she denied it, even if she explained, the doubt had already been planted, and she could feel it growing inside her silently. Join noticed her silence again. He stood up slightly, walking a small step away, running a hand through his hair in frustration. Not at her, but at the situation he couldn't understand. "I feel like I'm missing something important," he said quietly. Tieu shoulders tensed again, but she still didn't speak. At that moment, footsteps were heard outside the room. His mother was returning. The sound immediately changed the atmosphere again. Join straightened slightly, turning toward the door. The moment his mother stepped back in, her expression was calm and warm again, holding a tray with teacups as if nothing had happened at all. "Sorry for the wait," she said gently. "I brought more tea." She placed it down carefully on the table, then smiled at both of them. "So, what were you talking about?" The question sounded casual, but Tieu felt it like a warning. Join looked at her for a second, then back at his mother. "We were just talking," he said slowly. His mother nodded lightly. "Good." She sat down again, smooth and composed. The atmosphere shifted back into something normal, like a carefully arranged scene. Tea was poured. Small conversation restarted. But the tension never fully disappeared. Not for Tieu not for Join either. Because now, something had changed between them. Even if no one admitted it. Even if no one spoke it aloud. And as the afternoon continued, Tieu realized something quietly painful. The place she had briefly felt safe in was no longer simple, and neither was her place in it. The teacups were placed neatly on the table, steam rising gently into the air. Everything looked calm on the surface again, polite, organized, almost peaceful, but no one in the room truly felt that way. Tieu sat quietly, both hands wrapped around the warm cup in front of her. She wasn't drinking, she was just holding it, as if the warmth could anchor her to reality. Join sat beside her, but slightly angled away now, not distant, but thoughtful. His eyes weren't fixed on anything in particular. He was clearly trying to piece things together in his mind. His mother, on the other hand, was completely composed. She smiled occasionally, asked simple questions, kept her tone soft and normal, but every movement felt intentional, controlled, like nothing had ever happened earlier. "Tieu Hoa," she said gently, "do you like the tea?" Tieu Hoa startled slightly, then quickly nodded. "Yes, it's good." Her voice was quiet, careful. Join glanced at her briefly. He noticed everything now, the way she avoided eye contact, the way her hands stayed tense, the way her responses were short, delayed. Something had affected her deeply, and it wasn't just the injury anymore. His mother continued speaking casually. "You should eat more when you recover. Your body is still weak." Tieu Hoa nodded again. "Thank you." Join finally spoke. "Mum," he said. Just that one word. His mother turned toward him immediately. "Yes?" His expression was calm, but there was something different in his tone now, something more serious. "I think something happened while I was outside." The room shifted slightly, not visibly, but the air changed. His mother blinked once, then gave a small, polite smile. "What makes you think that?" Join looked at Tieu Hoa for a second. She immediately lowered her head. That alone was enough. Join turned back. "She's been different since I came back." His mother set her cup down slowly. "Different how?" Join hesitated slightly. He didn't want to accuse directly, but he also couldn't ignore what he was seeing. "She looks like she's been crying," he said quietly. Silence. Tieu Hoa's fingers tightened around the cup. His mother looked at her for a moment, then sighed softly. "Oh," she said gently, almost disappointed. "So, that's what this is about." Join frowned. "What do you mean?" His mother leaned back slightly. "I didn't say anything wrong to her," she said calmly. "We just talked." Join's eyes narrowed slightly. "That's not what she looks like." Now the tension was fully visible. Not loud, but sharp. His mother maintained her calm expression. "Join," she said softly. "Sometimes people misunderstand questions when they are already emotional." That sentence hit differently. Tieu Hoa's breath caught slightly, because it sounded harmless. But it wasn't. Join looked between them. His mind was struggling now. He trusted his mother, but he also trusted what he was seeing. And right now, those two things didn't match. Tieu Hoa finally spoke, very quietly. "Please, don't argue." Both of them turned to her. Her voice was small, almost fragile. "I'm really okay," she said again, forcing the words out. Nothing happened. But this time, no one fully believed it, not even herself. Join exhaled slowly, frustration mixing with confusion. "I don't understand what's going on," he admitted. His mother softened her tone again immediately. "There's nothing to understand," she said. "She's just tired. You're overthinking." But Join didn't respond right away. He kept looking at Tieu Hoa, trying to read her, trying to understand what she wasn't saying. Finally, he spoke quietly. "Did I miss something important?" Tieu Hoa shook her head immediately. "No." Too fast again, too defensive, and that only made things worse. Join stood up slightly now, pacing one step away from the table, rubbing his forehead lightly. "I feel like I'm stuck between two versions of the same situation," he said quietly, "and I don't know which one is real." Silence again. His mother stood up as well. "Join," she said gently. "You're imagining things because you care too much." Then she turned to Tieu Hoa. Her voice softened. "You should rest more. Emotional stress isn't good for recovery." Tieu Hoa nodded quickly. "Yes, I understand." Join looked at her again. Still no clarity, still no truth he could grasp. And that was what frustrated him most, because he could feel something was wrong, but he couldn't prove it. And Tieu Hoa wasn't helping him see it either. She was hiding it, or protecting someone, or both. He sat back down slowly, silent. The conversation slowly returned to small, meaningless topics, but the real conversation had already happened earlier, and it left a mark that none of them could erase. The room stayed quiet for a while after that. Not the comfortable kind of quiet that comes after a conversation settles, but the kind that feels like everyone is carefully avoiding the real subject, step by step, word by word. The tea had gone slightly colder now. Tieu Hoa still held her cup, but she no longer lifted it. Her gaze stayed lowered, fixed somewhere on the wooden table, as if looking anywhere else might make her emotions spill over again. Join sat beside her, but his posture had changed. Less relaxed, more distant. Not physically, he was still close, but something inside him had shifted. A quiet uncertainty had settled in, like a small crack forming in something he used to trust without question. His mother, however, remained composed. She sipped her tea slowly, occasionally making light comments, keeping the atmosphere normal in the most controlled way possible. But no one was truly inside that normal anymore. After a few minutes, Join finally spoke again. "I think," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "I should take her back home." His mother paused slightly. Her cup stopped halfway to the table. Tieu Hoa tensed immediately, her fingers tightening around the porcelain. His mother looked at him calmly. "Back home," she repeated softly. Join nodded. "She still needs rest, and I think she'll be more comfortable in her own space." There was a brief silence, not heavy, but deliberate. His mother placed the cup down with care. "That might be better," she said after a moment, "if that's what you think is right." Her agreement came too easily, too smooth. But Join didn't notice it fully, or maybe he didn't want to question it further. He turned slightly toward Tieu Hoa. "Can you stand up?" he asked gently. Tieu Hoa hesitated. For a moment, she didn't move. Her eyes flickered slightly, as if something inside her was resisting even this simple action. But then she nodded. "Yes." Slowly, carefully, she stood up. Her movements were cautious, still slightly unstable, but she managed. Join immediately moved closer, in case she needed support. But she didn't fully lean on him. She wanted to appear fine, even when she wasn't. His mother watched them quietly. Her expression was neutral again, but there was something unreadable behind it now. Something that didn't fully match her polite smile from earlier. As they reached the door, Join stopped briefly. He turned back. "Thanks for the tea," he said. His mother nodded. "Take care of her," she replied softly. Then her gaze shifted briefly to Tieu Hoa. Just for a second, but that second was enough. Tieu Hoa looked away immediately, and that small exchange, silent, controlled, incomplete, hung in the air as Join opened the door. They stepped outside. The air felt different immediately, lighter, but not necessarily better. The walk back to Join's house was quiet, too quiet. Join walked slightly ahead, occasionally slowing his pace to match Tieu Hoa's careful steps. She didn't speak. She didn't ask anything. She just followed. The path was familiar now, but it didn't feel the same anymore. At some point, Join broke the silence. "Are you really okay?" he asked. Tieu Hoa hesitated, then nodded. "I'm okay." But her voice didn't carry conviction. Join sighed quietly. "I feel like I don't know what's going on anymore," he admitted. That sentence made her stop for half a second. But she didn't respond because anything she said would either hurt him or make things worse. They continued walking. Eventually, they reached the small house again, the same place that had once felt safe. Join opened the door and stepped aside so she could enter first. Tieu Hoa walked in slowly. She paused in the center of the room, not because of pain, but because of feeling. Something had changed, not in the house, in her. Join closed the door behind them and turned to her. "I'll help you rest here a bit longer," he said. "Then we'll figure out what you want to do next." She nodded faintly. "Okay." He hesitated for a moment, then added quietly, "If something is bothering you, you can tell me." That sentence, simple, gentle, but it broke something inside her, because she wanted to tell him. She really did. But every time she tried, she saw his mother's face in her mind. The questions, the implication, the doubt planted carefully, without ever being openly cruel. And she realized something painful. Even if she spoke now, would he believe her fully? Or would something already be broken? Tieu Hoa lowered her head. "I'm just tired," she said softly. Join stared at her for a moment, then slowly nodded. "Okay," he said. But his voice didn't sound fully convinced anymore either. He turned away slightly, walking toward the table, placing his phone down. The distance between them in the room wasn't large, but emotionally, it felt much bigger than before. Tieu Hoa stood still for a few seconds longer, then quietly said, "I think I should leave soon." Join turned immediately. "What?" She didn't look at him. "I don't want to cause misunderstanding between you and your family." Silence. Join walked back toward her slowly. "That's not the solution," he said. But she shook her head. "It already started," she replied softly. That line stopped him. He didn't know how to answer it, because deep down, he could feel it too. Something had already shifted. Something subtle, but real. Join exhaled slowly. "I don't care about misunderstandings," he said finally. "I care about the truth." Tieu Hoa's eyes flickered slightly, but she still didn't speak. A long silence followed. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees again, like nothing had changed in the world beyond that small house. But inside, everything had. Finally, Join spoke one last time, quieter than before. "Tieu Hoa, do you trust me?" That question hung in the air, heavy, simple, unavoidable. Tieu Hoa closed her eyes briefly. Her answer came after a long pause. "I do." But it sounded like something she was trying to believe, more than something she fully felt. Join looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Then don't disappear again," he said quietly. She didn't respond, but she didn't disagree either. And in that silence, the story didn't end. It simply paused, on something fragile enough to break or heal. Join discovers Tieu Hoa injured beside a quiet stream and immediately rescues her, carrying her back home and taking care of her sprained ankle. During her recovery, She stays at his house and gradually regains strength, while their bond quietly deepens through small, caring moments. Later, Join brings her to meet his mother, hoping for a warm introduction. At first, the meeting seems peaceful and welcoming, but everything changes when Join steps out to take a call. His mother suddenly becomes cold and suspicious, questioning Tieu Hoa's intentions and accusing her of approaching Join for money or hidden motives. She even offers money for her to leave, deeply hurting Tieu Hoa. Although Tieu Hoa hides her pain from Join, the incident leaves a lasting emotional scar. After returning home, misunderstandings grow, and Tieu Hoa feels pressured to leave, while Join becomes increasingly confused about the truth.